Hello, everyone. Hi, and good afternoon, just about. Hi, everyone. My name is Laurie Claude. I'm the Vice Dean of the Libraries, and I'm here to welcome you today to the Menu Matters. I see that we have a full house. So welcome, bienvenue. I'm delighted to be here and to be part of this fascinating event. I'd like to start off by acknowledging that McGill University Library is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We honor, recognize, and respect these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which we meet today. As you may know, today is McGill 24, and it's the university's 9th annual Day of Giving. It's a wonderful opportunity to support a cause close to your heart because gifts stretch further today, helping to unlock challenge funds. When we reach 200 gifts of any amount, $130,000 will be released towards our libraries. This funding will create a better future, one filled with dynamic spaces, cutting-edge services, and world-class collections. So whether you contributed when registering for this event or simply cheering us on, we thank you and we appreciate your support. Now on to the main course, menus. Special occasions and holidays are usually celebrated with specific meals or menus. Over time, restaurants, hotels, cruise ships, and railway companies have created menus tailored to their patrons, leaving us with tangible artifacts of the foods and fashions of the past. They each tell their own story and that we'll hear about today. Alongside our rare cookbook collections, McGill Library's menu collection is a rich resource on the cultural, social, and material history of Montreal. Although most are from the 20th century, there are many that date back from the 1800s, mainly from Montreal area hotels and restaurants. A subset of menus relate specifically to travel and include train dining car menus and steamship menus. For those of you here in person, there's a selection on display in the case just outside this room, just over there to the left, and selected and curated by Jacqueline Sundberg, a librarian here at Rare Books and Special Collections. It's now my pleasure to welcome and introduce today's speaker, Professor Nathalie Cooke, or should I say it's my pleasure to welcome back. Nathalie to the library. From 2016 until 2022, Nathalie was Associate Dean of the Roar Unit with Rare Books, Osler, Art, and Archives were grouped together under one umbrella. During that time, Nathalie was a familiar figure at our events and our creative force here at the library. Nathalie teaches in the Department of English, and her publications focus on the evolution of literary and culinary taste. In addition to publishing articles on topics ranging from Montreal and the culinary imagination to riddling menus of the 1800s Britain, she is the editor of What's to Eat, Entrees in Canadian Food History, and co-editor of the Johnson Family Treasury, Household and Medicinal Receipts, 1741 to 1848, and Catherine Parr Trail's Female Emigrant's Guide, Cooking with the Canadian Classic. Nathalie recently co-authored Canadian Literary Fare from McGill Queen's University Press in 2023, which was an exploration of food scenes in Canadian literature. And her illustrated book on menus, Menu Matters, is forthcoming next spring, 2025. So what we'll hear today are a few of the stories from that project. Over to you, Nathalie. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Laurie. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. There's a secret. There are a couple of chairs in the front, and the chairs in the front are more comfortable than the chairs in the back. So that's the way we bribe you to the front of the room. All right. Thanks very much to the library for inviting me to speak here today. But my biggest thanks are actually to you in the audience. Yes, to the audiences online who I suspect are actually having a nibble at lunch at the moment. But special thanks to those of you in the room who are coming to listen to a talk about menus at lunchtime in a place where we're not allowed to bring food and drink because it injures the precious materials. But don't worry, because after lunch you'll be able to go to a restaurant here in Montreal armed with a few tips that I hope to share with you about how to decipher restaurant menus. So What is a menu? What information does it contain? What does it do? Answers to these three seemingly simple questions begin to unlock ways in which menus convey meaning to diners of their day, as well as to those of us in later generations who question them. Call us questioneers, to use Heston Blumenthal's wonderful phrase. Now, the term menu comes from minutus, meaning small, finely divided, or detailed. And lists become increasingly important when in mid-19th century meal fashions turned away from presentations of multiple dishes at the same time, what was known as service à la française, or French service. Think about medieval feasts and those tables with lots of food, to serving individual dishes to diners in sequence. And that's service à la Russe, or Russian service, which is what we are familiar with today. Despite the multiple advantages of Russian service, including minimizing the time for hot foods to cool while on display, cereal courses had the disadvantage of keeping food items hidden, prepared behind the closed doors of the kitchen. A menu's first responsibility then was to provide a preview of the foods available. Menus from the first restaurants of the late 18th century, Paris did just this, offering long lists of foods written on unadorned broadsheets. However, and this is really the subject of my talk today, menus contain much more than simple lists of food items. They record where and when a meal was served, often signaling special occasions. Design elements such as illustration and font style hint at the full dining experience, of which food was only a very small part. Descriptions of dishes, how they are named, and in what language they are described, speak volumes about the fashions of the day. In addition to being culinary documents, menus can be interviewed or deconstructed for evidence of the social customs of their time. And today, I'm going to lead you through a few such interviews. Please put your questioneering hats on. Okay. In addition to itemizing food options, menus also strategically position those options for a particular effect. For example, this 1980s Parisian menu seemingly lists in a very matter-of-fact terms the range of food options. But why does plum pudding appear in English among the list of items categorized as entremets de douceur? The only other dish named fully in English is the anglicized beef steaks, by the way spelled S-T-A-K-E-S, in rather violent fashion. Why evoke the pudding's British roots? And now, initially, we might suspect that it's given special prominence because of the pudding's iconic status. But this menu is from 1800, and plum pudding only achieved the height of its fame in mid-19th century by association with Christmas and Charles Dickens' 1843 Christmas classic, A Christmas Carol. Then reinforced by the recipe's appearance, this time as Christmas pudding, not plum pudding, in Eliza Acton's 1845 cookery book. Perhaps one answer is that pudding was a distinctly British dish, one served on French tables, but never wholeheartedly embraced by French cuisine, a subtle distinction communicated through language choice. Curiously, plum pudding earns the same privilege of being presented in its English spelling in such French language cookbooks as our own popular 1915 edition of La Cuisinière, 5 Roses, in which the 75 or so other puddings recipes are titled with the anglicized word pudding, even with the very British sounding pudding du Yorkshire. In other words, this Parisian menu signposts the significance of plum pudding and positions itself as part of a long tradition of doing so. Perhaps the most powerful argument to illustrate that menus do not always serve to clarify choices, but rather work to intrigue, mystify, engage, and allure, involves the frequent use of what is known as menu French, even to describe dishes prepared by and for individuals whose mother tongue is not French. Menus are also strategic marketing documents. Part of what they do is first convince diners to sit at the table and be tempted by the offerings, to be suggestible, as we sometimes now say in marketing lingo. In McGill's collections, we have a number of template menus provided by suppliers with graphics that draw attention to their products. Here, for instance, is a fixed price menu from the Grande Brasserie Lorraine in Nancy, France, which showcases and is sponsored by the liqueur Commelle Doré Cuisinier. Sorry, apologies for the pronunciation. This menu depicts a smiling satyr helping himself to a bottle from the shelf, while another bottle appears on the left with its label very clearly showing. The 1899 banquet for jury members of the musical competition for the Société Charitable des Fêtes Rochelaises is sponsored by the herbal liqueur Benedictine, a bottle of which is being served to the elegantly dressed diners pictured, and another displayed by a small cherubic figure on the menu's left banner. These template menus, which are actually rather lovely, demonstrate the possible and mutually beneficial relationships that could be struck between product vendors who produce the template menus for free and small restaurants in pursuit of customers. Now, advertising on these menus in our collection is pretty overt, but in our own day, menu strategic messaging is often much more covert. Here are some insights from menu engineers Michel Benesch and Greg Rapp, who remind us that menus contain decoy items, which the restaurant actually does not assume you'll order, but rather serves to position particular items it would like to serve you, in large part because of their profitability. In other words, don't order the tomahawk steak next time you go to a restaurant. First, watch for unusual terms, boxes highlighting particular items, especially if they're in the color red. Menu engineers are also very aware of the typical line of your site when perusing a menu. They tell us to think of the typical movement of your eye as following a reversed Z shape on a two-page menu, starting at the top right of the page and then moving down, following that reversed Z. Those of you who unlock your phones with a particular design, if you're using the reverse Z, be aware that it's a relatively common one, right? And on a one-page menu, one's eye is likely to start at the 10 o'clock position, then move to the top right of the page. So when you go to your restaurant meal after this talk, I dare you, I invite you to look closely at the menu and see how well designed it is. Now, my thanks to students Jersey Nadell and Jordan Stegu for finding this 1960s Italian garden menu, which is an amazing textbook example of these menu engineering techniques. What are you likely to order here, especially if you're close enough to the front that you can read the screen, right? Think of the reverse Z pattern. So likely steaks or spaghetti, which are listed at the top right of the menu, if the price isn't too much. Then you might go down to the bottom, baked lasagna, garlic bread, and bottom right, dry red wine, right? In the center of the two-page spread, cocktails, eggs, chicken, and liver don't get much of the precious menu real estate, do they? Now, we've spoken about what menus do, convince you to enter, order, enjoy. But what about when they decline to provide information, or when they deliberately mislead you, or tease you with misleading and curious information? I'm just going to offer 3 examples. First, consider this curious menu for an outdoor picnic luncheon. It's called Déjeuner sur l'herbe. Although it's dated 1830, the printing house indicated on the menu's stern didn't open for another 4 years, in 1834. Moreover, the artist, Henri Mourin, a French impressionist and modernist known for watercolor paintings, was born only 40 years after the date of this menu. And the well-known painting of the same name, Déjeuner sur l'herbe, was actually painted in 1863, more than 33 years after the date of the menu. So this curious menu seems to be for a historical meal then, but one that seems weirdly metaphorical and lightly fictional. The picnicking couple is dressed in fashionable clothes of the 1830s, and their mode of transportation, a horse and carriage, fits the period. However, the meal's courses seem to point to a narrative structure. Prologue, résistance, rather than the more typical course known as relever, or remove, and pour la fin, to end. Curiously, the wines accompanying this meal include huile de Vénus, or oil of Venus, and beaucoup de bonne humeur, literally translated as lots of good humor. Now, a publisher asked me to write about this menu along with 29 other menus, and I was a bit stuck because it didn't look like a menu to me. And I suspected that it wasn't a menu at all, but rather an illustration for a storybook. There's a lot of hidden information here. It's not a transparent document. My second example of a misleading historical menu is for a gala dinner. This one at the London's Carlton restaurant in June 1902. It's frequently reproduced, both because it speaks to a pivotal moment in multiple histories and because its various components were chosen with such care that they reward close scrutiny. This is the equivalent of a real classic novel for a literary scholar, for example. But the menu's evidence is misleading. And more than half, actually I'd say more than 75% of the books that reproduce this menu, it's frequently reproduced, seem to overlook or are completely unaware of the events as they unfolded. Now, in 1902, the renowned chef Auguste Escoffier ran the kitchens of the Carlton Hotel, while his long-term business associate, César Ritz, ran the hotel. This menu was conceived by Escoffier to honor a beloved gourmand who was going to be their ticket to wealth and fame, by the way, their loyal customer who was going to be crowned Edward VII, King of England, on June 26, 1902. Although the king himself would not be present at the gala meal, many of the guests who journeyed to London to attend the coronation would be staying at the Carlton Hotel, and number among the distinguished guests at this meal, funded by Ritz and Escoffier, by the way. Ritz had convinced his guests with rooms facing Pall Mall, where the royal parade would go by, to allow others to join them in their rooms to see the display. The menu declares its dedication in a number of ways, right? There's the Poulard Edouard set, which is named after the king. The template format of the menu features ermine and crown to signal a coronation, although the red rather than the purple velvet alludes to Saint Edward. And the battleship sailing across the top of the menu is a reminder that the Coronation Fleet Review was part of the coronation ceremony. Escoffier's most famous dish was perhaps pêche melba, a peach dessert first served on an ice swan in 1893 and named for the Australian opera singer Nellie Melba. For this occasion, we see pêche Alexandra, peaches poached in kirsch and maraschino liqueur with vanilla ice cream and strawberry puree, named to honor Alexandra of Denmark, who was Edward's wife. The poulard Edouard was a version of poulard derby, chicken stuffed with rice, poached and served with foie gras, whole truffles cooked in champagne. Edward was quite a large man, and this was his diet, right? Which Escoffier first served to the Crown Prince in the Grand Hotel in Monte Carlo as early as 1880. To honor the British Empire in India, to the chicken was added a curry sauce with diced red peppers, accompanied by creamed cucumbers. So the meal was quite luscious. However, famously, the meal was not to be. Edward VII fell ill before the coronation and underwent surgery for appendicitis. So the date handwritten by Escoffier on this menu is actually the date on which the gala had to be cancelled, rather than the date when the meal was held. César Ritz made the worrying announcement to those gathered for the lunch at the Carlton Hotel on the 24th of June, before collapsing from such nervous exhaustion that he never actually fully recovered. Escoffier would take over running the hotel and eventually hold another gala for Edward in August of that year. So to whom then does Escoffier dedicate the menu in this collection with the handwritten inscription, "À mon caillou"? Well, we in Quebec are uniquely positioned to answer this question, which actually hasn't been answered to date. It's typically ignored. While caillou literally means pebble or rock in French, the phrase is often used, especially here in Quebec, as an endearment for someone without hair. Think of children's books and the television show, Mon Petit Caillou, huh? Could this possibly be a dedication to the balding Edward VII, wishing him well on the day of his medical intervention? Now, for my third example of menus that withhold information, there are just some menus that are intended to bemuse and befuddle, engaging curious diners precisely by distancing them from the information they presumably seek with their hungry, rumbling stomachs. In 1805, a handwritten manuscript by Eliza Smithson contained table-setting diagrams in which the dishes were represented by riddles. What Adam gave Eve, for example, is a ribs dish, not an apple dish, a ribs dish, while a baronet represents sirloin, right? Since my initial discovery of this riddling menu, I've uncovered many, many more of what seem to be known as enigmatical bills of fare. Admittedly, my growing corpus of 1,500 examples continues to produce more questions than answers, and it's a phenomena that hasn't been documented, by the way. It's clear that many manuscripts were circulated and copied among coteries. Some have served as menus at dinner tables, while others appear to have been invitations as well. It's evident that many bills of fare were copied due to the number of identical menus that exist. See here the divine part of man boiled. Yes, soul, right? It's on both pages. It's clear that while many have been circulated by hand, others were disseminated through printed media outlets such as newspapers and almanacs. The enigmatic bill of fare does not yet exist as a classifiable subgenre, and while libraries have sometimes catalogued them under the expected categories of riddles and menus, they also exist under ballads, satires, and others. Enigmatic bills of fare further give rise to questions regarding riddling entertainments and practices of the period. Satirists, such as William Heath, and this is from our collection, Thomas Rowlandson and Woodward, from the early 19th century, used the visual enigmatical bill of fare and other riddling forms for comedy. These enigmatic bills of fare are clearly meant for entertainment. They come in large illustrated books, and by large I mean large, elephant folio illustrated books, and they'd be rented out by those hosting an evening event so as to wow their guests. While late 19th century enigmatic bills of fare appear to be educational, these are not. These are purely entertainment. So despite our lack of information about the British enigmatic bills of fare, we do have some information about a sister phenomena in the 19th and 20th century in North America, something called conundrum socials. The Chicago Times-Herald describes the practice. The plan is to serve a supper à la carte, presenting the bewildered guest with a menu and card written in enigma. From this, he must order at random, eating, of course, what is received. Throughout the 19th century, these conundrum-containing menus spread across the continent. Now, conundrum suppers made little claim to intellectual practice, and nor were they a strictly culinary tradition. Rather, in the spirit of the amusing satires of Britain's 19th century, conundrum suppers were pure entertainment and fabulous fundraisers. Take note, McGill 24, right? Quote, "It's great fun for the guests," unquote. What appears particularly enjoyable was the potential for hilarious error. Quote, "It caused much amusement to guess what one wanted, and many a person got a rather queer supper by his unlikely guesses." As one newspaper put it, the guests order blindly from the card. All manner of laughable mistakes and surprises are sure to follow, for if a man choose fragrant beans from Arabia, he will be sure of a good cup of coffee. But if he orders spring's offering, a glass of cold water will be his only lot. Now, of course, some menus assert themselves because they enchant us today, just as they must have pleased diners of the moment. The artistry of their design makes them treasured keepsake and accounts for their continued popularity as collectibles. Of particular note here are the menus of, I changed the slide order, so I'm just looking, of the renowned French literary society, Les Cent Bibliophiles, which claims patronage of such notable works as Charles Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal or Émile Zola's Germinal. For instance, the elegant 1913 summer banquet menu by the pastel artist Émile Auguste Renaud, who signs as Malo Renaud, showcases a woman in a cloche hat, with feather alongside her sleek saluki. By the way, I'm not sure it's a saluki. If you have a good answer for that, let me know. There was huge debate about the dog breed. The menu nods to Escoffier's culinary influence by including fraise melba, strawberries layered with ice cream and whipped cream, as one of the sweets. Presumably strawberries rather than peaches because of seasonality. Now, just as a quick aside, riffing on the topic of desserts melba, one influential argument about the nature of culinary developments is that culinary innovation originates in elite foodways, later filtering to other sectors. So highlighted in my talk today is the example of Escoffier's peach melba, which is later echoed in Fraise Melba of the 1913 menu here, and variations of which can be found on the internet very easily in our own time, right? Such culinary genealogies offer one additional rationale for the appeal of royal menus. Not only do they give readers a glimpse of the opulence on offer and sometimes the idiosyncrasies visible at the table of monarchs or stars, and I'm thinking here of Elvis, think of his Jell-O desserts, but these menus also provide example of food fashions and creations to which ambitious hosts might aspire. Now, to return to Les Cent Bibliophiles, and I'm really returning here, this is the 1919 banquet menu, which features a woman in a traditional Alsatian costume waving the French flag, giving precedence to symbolism rather than artistic style or movement. Her appearance celebrates the end of the Great War just months before, which included the annexation of the region of Alsace to France after more than 40 years of German control. Weirdly, the fare on this menu lacks any nods at all to Alsatian cuisine. But perhaps the most striking of Les Cent Bibliophiles menu is for the 1907 banquet, featuring an intimate portrait of the French artist Adolphe-Marie Timothée Beaufrère, of a woman undressing on a chair, positioned in front of a vase with flowers and a classical sculpture. Its title, Les bas, the socks, draws attention to the lower right portion of the page, far away from the bill of fare, which is positioned almost as an afterthought, the very last place one's eye might rest if you were to follow that reversed Z of the menu engineer's trajectory. Now, before concluding, let me pause to consider a series of menus that call for our attention, not so much for their artistry or their food selections, but rather because of the curious nature of their sponsor, the 13 Club. Now, there are lots of other curious clubs, of course, with intriguing menus. The Explorers Club, how many of you know of that one? Okay. The horribly named Savage Club, named after a poet, right? But these are known to some of you, I suspect. But I also suspect that very few of you know about the 13 Club. Do any of you know about the 13 Club? Okay. The 13 Club was founded by Captain William Fowler in 1890, who was put out when a lady of his acquaintance dismissed her 9-year-old daughter if the number of the table reached 13. The club meets on the 13th of every month. It continues, by the way. It's sponsored by William and Mary these days. Dining 13 to a table while attempting to defy superstition. Members enter the dining room by walking under a ladder. If they spill salt on the table, they're not allowed to throw it over their shoulder. And the room is adorned with fragments and shards of broken mirrors. The evening gatherings of the 13 Club follow a script. At 8:13 p.m. on the 13th room of Captain Fowler's cottage, and now presumably in William and Mary's dining lounges, 13 candles are lit prior to the serving of 13 courses. The first course features lobster salad, and it still usually does, featured on platters shaped like a coffin. And you will see in some of the menus various nods to the macabre, in defiance of superstition, perhaps. And here, you'll see the Latin phrase, morituri te salutamus, we who are about to die salute you. Now, the menus I've taken here from the 13 Club come from the New York Public Library's wonderful collection and show the life of club dinners beyond Captain Fowler's cottage. I'm particularly intrigued here that the annual ladies' dinner is marked by a menu and a title, but very, very rarely, here as elsewhere, by a photograph of any ladies. Here, for example, you'll see a photograph of the Cuban patriots of 1896, more than 13 of them, by the way, 3 years before the United States took control of Cuba from Spain. So to conclude, today we've considered the different roles menus play as culinary tracts, artifacts of visual and textual culture, strategic rhetorical documents, and reflections of social customs. Nicholas Landa, restaurant consultant and food writer, makes the enticing claim that a menu is the single piece of paper that gives the world the most pleasure. Menu designer Mary Lewis once described a menu to him as the invitation to a dance. So it's now time for me to turn things over to the head of Rare Books here, Jennifer Garland, who will offer us an invitation to join a sample of the menus in McGill's collection on the dance floor of culinary history. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Natalie. Stay close to the podium so we can have our dessert course. We'll open the floor for Q&A. On a personal note, many, many years ago, I was a research assistant to Nathalie Cooke, and I am very jealous of the students who got to work on this amazing material. We will open the floor for questions. For the people at home, please email your questions to info.library@mcgill.ca, and we'll receive them here in the room. For people in the room, we have a microphone that will pass around, so you'll raise your hand to signal your question, and that's so the people at home can hear the full question and answer. Questions in the room, please. Yes, I see a hand.
Where do such things as kitchen menus, the chef's menu, the cook's menu that she receives or he receives from the master, fit in with your overall idea of menus?
That's a wonderful question. Actually, New York is one of the best places to find a treasure trove of those kinds of things, because we have the journals of a number of the catering companies, and catering companies for some of the elegant households. And so those are menus in the sense, if you expand the definition of menu to be not a menu from which you order in a restaurant, but a menu that's the written trace of a chef or a cook's concept. And one of the best examples is actually, we have menu books here in the library, which are menu books for the year. Because you've probably heard, I suppose it's not a truism, it's actually true, that one of the most difficult things about preparing dinner is planning ahead and coming up with the idea of what to make for dinner. And so one of the solutions to that were these books that actually had menus for 365 days of the year. And they're not menus for restaurants to order, but they're prescriptions for what a cook in various different households could provide. So they don't fit into the book that I've written so much, mostly because it's an illustrated book and they're not terribly pretty. So I do include institutional regimens in prisons and in schools, but not typically for homes, just because the category is so large. You know, how do you boil that down? And the other thing I've been careful here, as you've noticed, I've provided historical menus, but in the showcase outside, you're going to see some much more contemporary ones where we're not as concerned about copyright because we can show you recent menus. Whereas if I reproduce them in a book, I have to get some very specific permission, and that's especially true for recent menus conceived by a good chef who's trying to provide some originality to his or her selection of fare. So it's a super question, and it floats up some of the tricky margins of this topic, if you know what I mean.
You were speaking of dancing before. Have you ever had the opportunity to study the social dance between menus, food trends, and social changes? What comes first, a social change or a food trend on a menu?
Wow, just tiny questions, eh? So my last name is Cooke, and when I wrote a book that was not about food, everyone kept referring to it as the cookbook, right? And I suddenly thought, maybe this isn't such a stupid idea. Food is a really important indicator of social change, right? So I started to look at citizen science and the biologists who were tracking food supply and demand when things came and went. And in Quebec, I was particularly interested in eel, for example, because when the first settlers came, eel was incredibly abundant, and especially for the French Canadians, it was a very popular alternative to meat on the meatless days. And suddenly eel got overfished, right? And so there were very specific dates for when eel was available and when it became overfished. And then I could look in the cookbooks and see if the cookbooks, and by consequence menus, followed those trends. And so my answer is, at least in my own research, I started with actual food supply. And then I looked to the way the trends followed the food supply. And then, of course, I realized I was wrong, and that it was actually the social norms that were driving the overfishing in the first place, right? Similarly, tourtière, which originally was a pie made from pigeon, but we know that the last carrier pigeon, or not quite true, but they say that the last carrier pigeon met his demise in 1904, and so the pie is typically made with pork these days. We think of it as a pork pie, but that had to do with the trends of supply and demand. So in that case, it was actually supply that drove the change in menu, which means that we now think of that iconic dish as a pork pie, unless we think of the large layered tourtière or jour de l'an, for example. So I've deliberately dodged your question by saying it's a chicken and the egg issue, and it's a fabulous question. But I do look at food, not because I'm particularly obsessed with finding the first instance of a particular recipe, but because it's a wonderful indicator of social change. It's a very concrete indicator for us about the persistence of certain habits and moments of pivotal change. And when I got into this business and started looking at food history, others had already entered the space. So there was a critic looking at heel heights. So that was out. I couldn't look at shoes and the way heel heights changed society. There was a person looking at hairstyles and hair color and the way that had changed with particular social norms. And so I chose food.
The next question is at home. Lauren will read the question.
Yeah, so we have a lot of great questions coming in online. This one is, do we have any surviving menus from the Order of Good Cheer or l'Ordre du Bon Temps in the first years of New France? And if yes, what might we speculate to have been served?
Great question. Just to bring you up to speed, the Order of Good Cheer was Champlain's attempt to boost morale, because he and his men were facing some pretty awful winters where he lost on the whole 50% of his crew during the winter. So how do you rally and make them a bit more excited? So the answer was you put on a wonderful spread and you have a parade with everybody coming in with the food to be served, and you created a kind of a ceremony and a ritual, right? So we do know some of the things they served. I mean, it was very heavy on game meat, for example. One of the excitements about French Canada was just the abundance and the bounty of food. You know, when people were coming for Europe and they were struggling for food, they couldn't believe that you could catch eel just by going and standing in a river and putting your hands out, or putting a net over, pigeons who came. So we know that there was a lot of wild game in that original, the Order of Good Cheer.
Another one from our virtual audience.
Great. How does the tasting menu fit into your discussion? Is this a relatively modern approach? It seems something created for a higher price point.
Yeah, can you hear in the back? How does the tasting menu fit? Okay. The tasting menu as we know it is a relatively recent concept. It's an interesting concept in that it changes the power dynamic between diner and chef, doesn't it? That suddenly the chef is in control not only of the choice of what to serve, but also the pacing of what to serve. And we've seen that in restaurants like Alchemist or Geranium. We actually see that the chef is prescriptive in terms of not only serving food, but also serving a certain narrative structure to the meal. So we're seeing that as a relatively new concept. But the notion of a tasting menu, how is that different from a bill of fare? You know, when you think about Chaucer's pilgrims traveling from place to place, and when they ended up at a particular tavern, they ate what was on offer that night. So that's a version of a tasting menu where, you know, the person in the kitchen was providing what was available in the kitchen. But we've certainly changed that dynamic when you think about the price point of a tasting menu.
There's one more from home.
What types of menus and artifacts are being captured from today's food scene for posterity? Who is actively doing that work? How are these things being chosen? The students from my class in the room already know some answers to this because we're going to be speaking to one of the collectors soon. In the early days, menus were collected by people who we all thought were insane, to be honest. I mean, just wrong. You know, so someone like Barbara Haber at the Schlesinger at Harvard decided to collect food trivia because it was cheap. She had virtually no acquisitions budget. And so she thought, you know, these women like Julia Child and MFK Fisher are doing interesting things. One day, these will be important. And she started to collect, you know, the cookbooklets by the food spokespersonalities, the Betty Crockers, for example, or our Canadian equivalents. And they were cheap to collect. And ultimately, they became a really important source of information. Other New York collections have done the same thing. So there was actually a woman who was trained in dentistry and medicine who decided to collect menus because she was intrigued what it said about health and what people were consuming and how our notions of health changed over time. And that ultimately became the collection of menus and culinaria that's at New York Academy of Medicine, right? A woman called Frank Butolph decided to collect a group of menus, and again, you know, a relatively idiosyncratic collection, which has now become the basis of the New York Public Library's collection of menus. It's one of the largest in the world, right? So there are a number of individual collectors who have collected things that seemed idiosyncratic at the time. My favorite one is by an ophthalmologist called Bernard Fried, who lived in New York in the 1970s or so and went out to eat with his wife at local restaurants in New York, never dining at the same place twice, choosing random, everyday kinds of menus. His wife was on a perpetual diet and typically didn't eat with him, but he recorded what she ate. You know, which cookies she bought from the grocery store, at what price, with what sorbet. And he kept the menus and he scribbled on them.
And as a result, New York Public Library has one of the best treasure troves of descriptive practice that we have in the world. Because these are random everyday menus that nobody wanted to collect, which actually tell us what people were eating in New York in the 1970s and what they were buying for their cheap desserts afterwards, the cookies and the brands and the, it's not a particularly aesthetically pleasing collection. So there's one answer. The other answer is that there are some collectors who actually have an eye for this stuff. So we're going to be speaking to a man called Henry Voigt, who used to be CEO of a company, and when he retired, he realized that Etsy and eBay had some good deals on menus. And he started to collect them. He specializes in American menus, and he's just bright. He's smart. He interviews the menus, and he figures out what they tell you about the foods and the places and the practices, and he blogs. And so it's open access blogs. Everybody can read it. And he is willing to share the menus. You pay for reproduction of his photos. He's very available. He's on Twitter, now X, right? And I think he's been doing it for about 20 years now. And his menus are very valuable. I think he was buying them probably when they were $1 or $2 each. They're not now. Does that answer the question?
Thank you so much. I think we have time left for one more question from the room. I see a hand. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Nathalie, your research is based on the fact that there are documents that you can access, printed documents. There seems to be a trend that started during COVID, where you go to a restaurant and you have to use your smartphone, QR code. And recently I was in the Dominican Republic at this fancy restaurant. You didn't get a printed menu. You got an iPad, and on the iPad there was the menu, and nobody explained to you how to use the iPad, and everything is it's not that every iPad is different, but how you access it, how you lose it. And the menu was, I think, about 15 pages long. So, in terms of future research by people interested in the history of menus, what does that mean if future documents are digital instead of printed?
Okay. I'm going to take that question in two parts, right? The first part is, QR codes. I got into a shouting match with my publisher about this because he was talking about, what about the digital menu? And so I produced a couple of QR codes, and then he said they're ugly. And the person in charge of the images for the book said, I don't want to reproduce these, right? That people know what QR codes are. You can describe it. So the compromise was I've produced an emoji menu, which comes from Singapore, right? Just to show that we can communicate through different means now, and that we're willing to be flexible to see these different means. But what's the difference between the QR code and the Blackboard menu, for example? Or the waiter who comes and describes something to you? It's very ephemeral, and it's to do with the dining experience. And it's clear that we can only recapture a very small part of the dining experience, right? So then the second part of the question is, what about future researchers in terms of menus? Well, we are under the mistaken impression that now that we can digitize everything will last forever. And I can look to the librarians in this room, and we know that that's probably a lifespan of about 25 years, because of outdated technology that we're constantly going to be. So we see a different kind of ephemerality that's occurring. So it's not just the QR code, not just the COVID experience, that it's much easier for me to access a feather book with bird parts from the 1600s, which is available here in rare collections, than it is for me to access the floppy disks that some of us perhaps were using, earlier in our very short lives, So the answer is, it will be interesting to see what that means for menus. But I do hope, and I hope to participate in that, in expanding the definition of menu. That when you talk about menus now, and I say I'm writing a book about menus, everybody assumes you're writing about restaurant menus, right? And actually the questions here today already open that up. Well, what about the ones that aren't written? What about the ones that are in chefs' heads? What about the ones that are, to do with kitchen receipts and kitchen instructions? So I hope if we open up that discussion and we actually think of it more as a dance, literally, as having the kinds of the scripts and the performances and the different iterations, that we'll actually get much closer to an embodied and enlivened understanding of what a menu can be. And I know, Diana, I know Diana. She's from ETHQ, and I know actually that you have a much broader sense of menus and the possibilities. So thank you for that.
Thank you. That's all the time we have for today for the questions. Thank you, Nathalie Cooke, so much. Can we have a round of applause? Thank you. Thank you all for being here and being part of McGill 24 today. Every gift, large and small, contributes to all of the activities you see here, acquisition of materials, online and physical books, and also the important restoration of our rare and special collections. Thank you. Before you leave this space, for those of you on site, as you exit the room, you turn immediately to your left and you'll see the exhibition that's pictured here on this slide. If you're curious to find out more about our collections, go to our website, the McGill Library website, and you'll find a wonderful archival collection called the Menu Collection, and you can have a look there. Thank you for being here. Good day. Thanks,